Hey, this is Elijah with the Oxygen team, and in this video, we're going to look at how to create a design system. A design system is an important set of rules and constraints for your website design. Now, some design systems are incredibly extensive. We're not going to go that far, but what we are going to do is show you a quick way to establish and display things like colors, spacings for padding and margin, typography rules, border radius, and box shadows. Now, Oxygen gives you a lot of tools to go ahead and set these up in the settings, so we will be talking about that as well, but we'll also be setting up a page called Design System that will give us a quick visual reference of these rules that we are establishing. So let's jump over to Pages. And I already have a page here created called Design System, so I'm going to click Edit with Oxygen. Now that we're inside of Oxygen, we're going to set up 4 different sections. Basically, section 1, we'll go ahead and add it here. And we're going to add a heading, and we'll call this Colors. And then let's add another section, and this section is going to be for spacing. And another section, this one's going to be for typography. And then our final section will be for box shadow and border radius. These are the 4 basic categories we're going to work with in this specific design system. These are usually enough to get you a nice set of rules for a nice consistent design. And if you're really not a designer, establishing these rules very early on can help you to maintain the consistency throughout the build of your site. So let's go up and let's start with colors. We're going to use a couple of tools to grab some color palettes, but I like to have a way to display these. So let's go ahead and just create a div. We're going to set it to stack child elements horizontally. And then let's add another div. And we'll add some styles to this. We'll go to advanced size and spacing. We'll set its width to something like 200, height 200. And then we're going to go to borders and set the border radius to 50% to make it a circle. And then you can see if we go to advanced background, now we can set the background color of the circle to display the color. But first, we have to decide what colors we want. Now, there are a few different places I like to go to generate color palettes. But one of my favorites is called PALX. And I'm just going to jump over to a new tab and paste this URL in. It's palx.jxnblk.com, which is just a nightmare to have to explain on a microphone. But I will make sure I have a link in the description of this video. So what this does is it takes a base color and it generates all the different shades you need for your design. And normally you only need probably these top 2 here. But to determine our base color, let's go back into Oxygen and let's just pick a color we like. And I usually default either to like a pinkish red or a purple or something like that. Let's go down here. Maybe something like that. Okay. So let's grab that base color and let's jump over to PALX, paste that in, and then click Update. Now this is going to give us a bunch of shades that we can use, and you may not need them all, but it is a good idea to have these available. And one cool part is it generates saturated grays for you, which are kind of nice because saturating your grays with your base color can make them a little less lifeless. So now we just have to decide which colors we want and throw them into our global styles. So let's grab a couple of these grays. Let's grab the very dark one, and we'll grab maybe gray 4. And then gray 0 for a very, very light. So let's do those first. We'll jump over here, and here's where Oxygen comes in. We have a lot of global settings that let you kind of establish your design system by default so that it doesn't have to be done so manually later on. So we'll go to Manage, Settings, Global Styles, Colors. You can add a new color set here, but I'm just going to use the default global colors folder because we don't have any colors in there yet. It's a blank slate. So let's jump over here and let's grab gray 9 as our very dark gray. And we're going to add a color and we'll call it dark gray. And we'll paste that in. And then let's jump over here and let's grab gray 4 as kind of a mid gray. Copy that hex code. Jump over, add another color, call it mid gray, and paste it in. And then let's add another one over here. Let's add, I think I want gray 0. It's almost white. So you have to be a little bit careful about how you use some of these, light gray. But it is nice to have several shades. And in a lot of cases, I'll actually go ahead and copy all of these over. Now, I don't end up using all of them, but they are handy to have directly in Oxygen. That way, if you decide, well, gray 0 is too light, you don't have to go switch it out. You just have all the shades available. Next, we're going to grab our base color here, this pink. I usually ignore the rest of these colors. Now, I think if you're a designer, you probably could use these with the base color in a way that would look great, but I'm really not a designer, so I'm not brave enough to try to incorporate those other colors. So we're going to go up here and we're going to, again, grab the pink 9, and we'll add that in. We'll call it dark pink. And then we're going to grab, may as well stick with our pattern. We'll grab pink 4 as a kind of a lighter shade. Go over here and call this mid pink and drop it in. And then let's grab one more shade of pink. And I don't think I want to go all the way white because we already have this gray up here. So I think I just want to go very light pink, but not as close to the white as we went on the grays. So let's jump over here and we'll call this light pink. Okay, so that's a really good starting color palette. And it's also the key, again, for non-designers is a safe color palette. We know pretty much all these colors go together. So establishing these colors early on really help us later because they limit the decisions we can make and they limit the mistakes we can make. So let's jump over here to this little div we created and we'll just go ahead and establish these with the colors that we've picked. First, let's add some spacing here. So let's grab this div. Advanced size and spacing, let's just add 8 pixels of margin. Okay, and all right, now let's duplicate that and go to the background and change the color. We're gonna list our grays here first, and then advanced background. We're gonna do light gray, which pretty much blends in with the background. We can actually change the background color of this section a little bit if we want, so it doesn't all blend in so much. Said it's kind of a very light gray because we don't want to clash with these colors that we have, but we do want to be able to see these very light shades. So now that we have our grays, we can actually go ahead and just duplicate this div. Let's add some margin on top, space it out a little bit, and then we'll set these to our pink hues. So we'll go to the dark one and then advanced background. Go to the middle one and advanced background, and we'll go to the lightest one. All right, so these colors are all registered in Oxygen, so you're not going to need to grab them off the page, but what this does is it creates kind of a visual story of your overall design. So at a glance, you can look at this page and see the colors you're using, the spacing, all these things. And actually, if you're doing this at the very beginning of a build or before your entire site is designed and you plan on handing things over to a designer, you could actually give them this design system to work off of so that they work within the constraints you've established. Now let's move on to the spacing section. So spacing is going to be basically our paddings and our margins. Now the increments you use are up to you, but I like to stick to an 8-point increment. So where we're going 8, 16, 32 pixels, etc. The reason for this is that some Retina displays have 2x and 3x scaling, and the 8-point system really scales very well on those types of displays, whereas other increments might not scale so well. You might end up with some half pixels, which can result in blurring and things just not looking how you want. So I like to use an 8-pixel increment. It just makes it really easy. It's easy to remember how far up and down to go. But as part of the design system, I like to go ahead and basically just jot those things down. Now, when talking spacing, we can set up one thing in our Oxygen settings, which will make this a lot easier, and that's the default padding for sections. So these have a default top padding of 75 pixels, bottom of 75, left and right of 20. And we can change this default by going into Manage, Settings. We'll go back to Global Styles, and we go to Sections here. And in our case, since we're using an 8 pixel increment, I'm going to set these top and bottom paddings to 64 pixels. And left and right, I'm going to go ahead and go to 16, and we'll go ahead and save that. Now all of our sections by default will have consistent padding that works with our 8 pixel increment. Now I like to just write down a few different spacings that we might use. So we'll click add, and we're going to make just a list type of situation here. This is going to be our container div, and then we're just going to add some text here. We're going to start with our smallest increment here, 8 pixels. Great. And then let's just add some size and spacing, some padding there. Let's add 8 pixels left and right. And then we're just going to duplicate this text element a few times to get the increments we want. We're going to set the div to stack horizontally. We're going to go 8, 16 pixels, 32 pixels, 64 pixels. So this gives us our basic increments. Now, what I've done in the past is I've established what each increment should be used for. For instance, 8 pixels might be for elements that are closely related. 16 pixels might be for elements that are related but not super closely. 32 pixels for unrelated elements, and 64 pixels for things that shouldn't be close to anything else. Now, it's up to you if you want to go that far. What establishing those scenarios does is it makes your decision-making process much easier when you're actually building the site. You don't have to sit there and wonder, well, should I use 8 or 16 or whatever? You know, based on the elements that you're spacing, what you should use. And let's just add one more here because sometimes you need a really big gap. So I'm going to add 128 pixels. And again, this isn't set up in the rules or anything. This is just a visual reference for us. So when we're designing, we can pop over to this page and be like, oh yeah, we're using an 8 pixel system, and these are what I should stick to. Now let's move on to typography. So typography is one of those things that is so critically important, but if it's done right, you probably don't notice it. If it's done wrong, you probably can't notice anything else. So it's a very subtle art. But having good typography is really, really important. And the thing I usually start with on typography is my heading font and my text font, both of which can be defined in Oxygen's global settings. So to find a good pair of fonts, I almost always use Google Fonts, but there's a website called fontpair.co. I'm going to jump over there. And this gives you pairs of fonts that look nice together. And I'm not really a typography master, so making these kinds of decisions is a little difficult. And having a list like this that's been prepared for me is very convenient. So I usually just scroll through and find something that kind of fits the vibe of the site that I'm working on. So here is Fira Sans and Merriweather. Let's just do that. So those are both Google fonts. So we go in here to Manage, Settings, go back to Global Styles, go to Fonts, and we're going to do Fira Sans and Merriweather. Great. So even our design system is already starting to look a little better now that we have some nice fonts in use. The other thing regarding typography we can do in Oxygen's settings is we can set up our heading sizes. I usually like to go a little bit bigger on the H1, so I'll set that to 42. We'll do 36 on this, and then these H3 through H4 are fine. I rarely use H3 through H4, but you might. So you want to determine the sizes, font weight, and line height, colors, all these things here in the global settings. And I usually like to set my heading color to one of my global colors, like our dark gray there or our dark pink. That actually looks kind of nice, so we'll do that. And then for font weight, it's a good idea to only use a couple of different font weights because it can get pretty messy if you start changing them a lot. I like to use 600 for my heavy fonts and then just default for the ones that I don't want to be so heavy. Now, there are times where your heading might want to be a little bit lighter, maybe not that light, but if it's on like a dark background or something and you set it to white, it might look nice to lower the weight. So make sure you figure out what weight you want to use. And we'll go ahead and jot those down here in a minute. The other thing that's really important is setting your heading line height. I like to set it to about 1.2 so that the line height for the headings is not super big. So now that we have these rules, we can go in here and add a heading, and we'll call this H1, and that's 42 pixels, weight 600, and then we'll duplicate that, and we'll set this to H2, and this is gonna be 36 pixels, and it's still weight 600 because these settings in the global styles headings menu are all inherited downward. So it's 36 pixels, weight 600, and this is H2. Now we'll duplicate that and we'll go to H3, and that's going to be H3, and it is 24 pixels. And actually, now that I'm looking at it, this is another benefit of this. That's way too big of a jump between those. So let's set that back up to something like maybe 28. Or maybe 32. 32 looks pretty good. So we'll set that to 32, and we'll say here 32 pixels. And again, we don't have to type out what these things are because it's all set in the settings. But for the sake of a quick glance and seeing what your overall design system is, especially if you're sharing it with someone else, this is really, really handy. I rarely use anything smaller than an H3, so I'm not going to go beyond that here. But if you do, feel free to list all your headings out. Now, the other thing we're probably going to want to do is just say what font we're using. So we're going to say heading font. It's going to be Fire Sans. Perfect. And then let's just add some spacing here. And again, we're using an 8 pixel increment. So we added 16 pixels of spacing there. And we'll add some below this too, because we're about to jump into text font. So let's add a text element, and we'll just say text. Actually, body font, I think, is how it's defined here. And actually, we can go back here, and in, not fonts, but in body text, we can define some rules here as well for typography. So 16 is usually the minimal size that you want to go with on a body font. The rest of these settings are probably good, but I probably would set this to maybe our dark gray there for the color. So we'll go and delete this text element. We'll just add a new one real quick. And we'll say text font. It's going to be Merriweather. And then duplicate that. And text size, 16 pixels. And font weight, 400. Okay, so now at a glance, we have our typography settings here as well. So we're colors, spacing, typography. Now we're on to the final section, which is box shadow and border radius. So Oxygen has a pretty incredible class system. So what you can do is you can set up these really cool systems of classes that are easily accessible by just typing them in, and they kind of autocomplete and you can click the one you want. Now, setting up that kind of a class system is probably a whole separate video, but two things I almost always like to set up is a class for box shadow and a class for border radius. That's because it's just way quicker to add them as a class rather than going in and fiddling with the settings. So let's just add a div here, set it to horizontal, and then let's add another div, and let's go to advanced size and spacing, set it to 200 by 200. And this will be our box shadow div. So let's add a class to it. We'll call it box shadow. Now you can prefix this if you want, but most sites, I just have one box shadow class. So I just add one called box shadow because that's easy to remember. And then for my shadows, what I like to do is a little different than probably what you're used to, because you can totally go to advanced effects, box shadow, and create a shadow here. But I like fancy shadows. So I like to go to a website called brum.af/shadows. And this lets you generate multi-layer shadows. You can bring down the layers. You can adjust final transparency, final vertical distance, all of these things, and get a really, really nice natural looking shadow because it layers all these different shadows with different values. So let's bring these layers down, and then you just copy the CSS, go back over to Oxygen, and with your box shadow class selected, go to Advanced Custom CSS and just paste that in. And then what I like to do is within this div, let's go back here. Make sure you're not changing settings on box shadow aside from adding the custom CSS, because you don't want to mess with that. You don't want to like set this to a certain width or something, because then everything you try to add a shadow to will have that width. So let's go back to the ID and let's go to layout and let's make sure everything's going to be centered. And then let's add just a little text element that shows our class box shadow. Perfect. Let's add some spacing below this heading. Spacing below this one too, just doing a little bit of last minute cleanup here. And then back down here. So now we have our box shadow class and we have a visual representation of what applying that class is going to do. So now let's duplicate this and we're on the ID. So we're going to add some spacing to the left-hand side. We'll add say 32 pixels of margin. And then we're going to want to get rid of that class because this is going to be for our border radius. And our class is going to be called rounded corners. And now let's add that class, rounded corners, to this div. And then let's go to advanced borders and let's set it to something like, I don't know, 4 pixels. Now, sometimes you'll want something like 4 pixels and 8 pixels for different situations. Actually, I'm going to go with 8 pixels. But usually one border radius is enough for most cases, and then you can kind of adjust it as needed. But usually stick with this main class you've set up because then your border radius will always be consistent. Now, let's go back to the div ID, and we need to set the background color to something else. Let's do this dark purple, and then go back up here. And let's double check that border because it looks like it did not take. Oh, I put pixels in there, which I do not need to do because the unit's already added. Now let's save and let's change this text color to something lighter, like our light gray here. Okay, so let's save and look at the front end. Close this guy out, jump up here. So now if we go to our website /design system, that's usually where I put them. We have our colors that we want, which of course you probably add a few more shades here. You have your spacing, you have your typography, and you have your shadow and border radius classes. Now, back to these classes, let's say we were building a page. We'll just add another section below this. And let's say we added a div with background color of something like this, and size and spacing, we want it to be 100% width. And then we added a heading in there and set the color to light gray. Now we're in design mode, right? We have these elements. We want to make them look good. So we know that we need to add some spacing to the div. So we go in and we go to size and spacing, and we know we're using an 8 pixel system because we have it listed up here. So let's do 32 pixels on all sides. And let's change this to design system. And then say we want to add a box shadow to this. Instead of going into the settings and changing it there, we're just going to go up to the classes and type shadow. And guess what? There it is. Add it. We've got our shadow. And then we want to add our rounded corners. We'll do the same thing except for type rounded or corners, and we'll see the suggested class. Great. Now we can add, say, a text element. And we can change the color of it. And of course we have our colors. Now the other thing we probably will use sometimes is pure white, but we can also use this light gray. And because we know what spacing to use, we can add say 16 pixels here. And just like that, because we've established our design system, no hard choices had to be made there. We knew exactly what to do and exactly how to do it without having to sit there and rack our brains about what kind of spacing to use, what kind of font to use, etc. Everything's set up for us. Now, of course, design systems can go way, way deeper than this, but this is kind of the baseline that I've found is necessary for me personally to achieve really nice consistency in my designs. So again, this is Elijah with the Oxygen team, and that's how to set up a quick and easy design system for use in your Oxygen site builds. Thank you for watching.